And this was, of course, amazing. And I took him to the barrack, and I couldn't talk to him, but there were some Polish people who could understand, and he told us he was a scout, the forerunner to see if the Germans were there before the army was going to come in. But he couldn't do anything, couldn't help, he left again. And a few days later, more Russians came with horses, with wagons, with tanks, with all kinds of things, and as well a field kitchen. And they cooked us a meal and cabbage soup, which tasted wonderful, but it was just too difficult for us to digest. Many people died because the effort for the body to digest something was just too much. And me as well, and many other people sat the whole night on a bucket because, again, you know, it was just too heavy food to eat. And from then on, we had to be very, very careful what we ate and how much we ate. But I did many mistakes because food was really very, very necessary for our bodies and for us. You know, we were very, very greedy. Eventually, the Russians decided they wouldn't leave us there. We went to Auschwitz, a man camp, to try to find my father and brother. And they were not there anymore. But I met two people who I've known from Amsterdam, and one was Otto Frank. And the first question, of course, he asked, "Have you seen my family?" And we hadn't seen them. Because the new transport always were put in a different part of the camp, because they didn't want the old inmates to know what was happening outside. We would have known that the D-Day had happened already, that the Germans were losing the war, but if we didn't know anything, we had really no idea how long we would have to be there, if we would make it at all. So, and he had told us that he had seen my father and brother, but they had gone on those transport. But at the time, of course, we thought that can't be bad if they went into a factory to work in Germany. So eventually the Russians took us, brought trains again, and they didn't want to leave us there because once the Germans even came back again, there was fierce fighting around there. And so they decided they would evacuate us, they would take us east. We couldn't go west because the war was still on. And we traveled with them for 4 months. We traveled, and the unbelievable devastations which I saw in Poland, in Romania, in Ukraine, in Russia was just unbelievable. The Germans had burned down every town, every village, every field. There was just nothing. People seemed to crawl out from under the ground when a train came, because they wanted to know as well who is on the train, have we got news from the soldiers, and as well there was Jewish people, where we came from and so on. So there was always exchanges and things like that. And eventually we ended up in Odessa, and there we waited for the end of the war. Now what I wanted to tell you is the Russians looked we got Russian uniforms, which I was very proud of. They clothed us, they fed us, they gave us whatever they had, whatever they had, they shared with us. And not long ago, I saw in January, when Holocaust Memorial Day, oh, this is a picture. This is me with the Russian uniform. Of course, this is a picture taken later, and now it wouldn't fit me anymore because it was a very, very small size. But at that time, of course, it was wonderful, and I still got it. I'm very proud of it. And on the 27th of January for Holocaust Memorial Day, I got an article from a friend written by a famous historian, Lawrence Rees, who did a big BBC program about the world of the war, and he writes, raped by the saviors, and as well, when the Red Army liberators who opened the gates of Auschwitz 65 years ago this week, the survivors thought their nightmare had ended, but shocking testimony reveals it was the start of another unimaginable ordeal. And when I read that, I was furious, because the Russians treated us with respect, with love. They shared everything they had, and then somebody writes something like that. I wrote to him, and I objected to this, and he said, well, I wrote as well in this article, the Russians gave sweets to the children. So it shows you that they were not as bad. I said, well, first of all, the Russians didn't have sweets. It was the Americans who had sweets. And secondly, even if you would give a few sweets and then rape and kill the people, that, you know, you can't compare that. And then he said, well, I had the testimony of one woman, and it's just very interesting. I'll just read this to you, because it puts things in, and explains this as well. You know, some Polish people, when the Germans had left, said, well, we are going to go home because it's only a few miles from here, or even 30 miles, and we can surely find a way and somebody will help us. And there were many, many SS people who took off their uniforms and pretended they were inmates, because they thought if they are called as SS, you know, good knows what the Russians will do. So, of course, the Russians had to be very careful. I've got here as well, we'll show it to you later, a certificate from the Russians, which they gave every inmate. We had to show our number, and so prove who we were, that we were a victim and not one of the perpetrators. And so he met somebody, a Russian soldier, met somebody running in Poland in a field, and so that's what he writes. One day, just weeks after she had been liberated from Auschwitz, and while she and her sister were still trying to make their way home, Helena managed to borrow a bicycle and went for a ride. That sounds all very peculiar. It was midwinter, you know, January, and the snow was that high, so she borrowed a bicycle. It was one of the first moments of joy she had felt for years. With the sun on her neck, the wind in the air, and fresh countryside around her, she finally felt free. After she had ridden for a little while, she stopped at the side of the country road for a rest. Then she saw a Red Army soldier approaching on a motorbike. The soldier stopped and looked at Helena, bright and pretty in front of him. Well, from Auschwitz, as a victim, she can't have seen that bright and pretty. He had seen a young woman, says Helena. He threw his motorcycle down, and the terrible battle began. I don't know how I managed to get away from this cruel Russian soldier, this criminal. If she was an Auschwitz victim, she couldn't have been strong. She couldn't have fought a big, strong Russian soldier. He hadn't had sex in a long time, but he did not manage to rape me. I kicked and beat and I screamed, and he asked me all the time if I was German. You see, he thought she was probably a Nazi. I said, no, I'm Jewish from the camp. I showed him the number on my arm, and at that moment he recoiled. Maybe he himself was Jewish. I don't know what he was. He turned and stood up and ran. So this, you know, it doesn't make sense at all, but it shows you that they didn't harm any Jewish people. But nevertheless, he wrote this awful article. And why I mention this, and why I think it is so important, because, you know, there are Holocaust deniers. People say the Holocaust hasn't happened. And I'm very much afraid when we are not around anymore, there will be many, many more people who will start to deny the Holocaust. And if people can write things like that, and many people who read this article did believe it, so how dangerous it is to write things which are not correct. And, you know, I can't understand how he comes, because from this one woman, he makes out that all the Russians raped all the Jewish prisoners who they liberated. I have no complaint whatsoever about the Russians. We were 4 months with them, and you know, I would have heard anything if anything was wrong.